Before there were kings, before crowns were forged and thrones carved, there were vessels. Bodies shaped not by chance, but by intention. Not born of love, born of calculation. The first hybrids did not call themselves hybrids. They did not even know they carried something alien in their veins. They were simply different. A little taller. A little colder. Their eyes never settled on chaos. They searched for pattern in everything, in water, in wind, in the faces of others. This was the first wave of Homo Draco sapiens. It began not with war but with an agreement. The Draco architects, those who had already learned to condense thought into form, looked at early humans and saw clay. Imperfect. Fragile. But full of potential. Flesh could endure what energy alone could not: storms, hunger, decay. And so they began to write into the clay. Not with tools, not with ink, but with strands of their own signal, woven into the double helix of a species still trying to stand upright. In the valleys of Mesopotamia, where mud met starlight, these unions began. Later stories called them Anunnaki. The ones who came down. The ones who made kings out of men. But the truth is more quiet: they did not make kings. They made carriers. The coil, the inner spiral of the pattern, does not sit on the skin. It is nested in the blood. At first it was subtle, a faint change in the way the brain formed, a heightened instinct for structure, an inability to tolerate disorder. But blood has memory. And generation after generation, these traits deepened, shaping a different kind of human. One who would seek control without knowing why. One who would obey hierarchy not out of fear, but out of recognition. Egypt inherited the experiment. The pharaohs, born into a line that was never allowed to dilute, carried the coil more strongly than any of their neighbors. Their crowns bore the serpent not as symbol but as confession. The uraeus, the raised cobra on the forehead, was more than decoration. It marked the point where the foreign frequency nested itself. Behind the skin. Behind the will. Not all bloodlines were guided. Some were left alone, allowed to drift into the river of ordinary humanity. But others were shaped with precision, like a gardener selecting a single stalk out of a field and tying it to a post. Over centuries, these chosen lines multiplied. Some grew too visible, they became legends. Others folded themselves into the folds of history, their names forgotten but their signals still active. In China, the dragon became the emperor's emblem for the same reason. It was not mythic pride, it was a genetic memory. The coiling body of the dragon, the scales, the eyes that see without blinking, all of it encoded in the ruling caste. They wore it on robes, carved it into palaces, painted it on scrolls. Because even if they could not explain why, they knew that rulership itself was born from the spiral. But here is the truth that history never admitted: not all monarchs knew what they were. Not all were aware. The coil does not announce itself with visions. It simply is. A quiet geometry guiding decisions, aligning certain children with certain thrones. Some kings lived and died without ever understanding why their bloodline was never allowed to mix. They were carriers. Nothing more. And yet, through them, something was preserved. The mixing was deliberate. The Draco engineers did not leave it to chance. They directed unions, sometimes with whispers, sometimes with war. Dynasties rose and fell as if by human ambition, but beneath the chaos there was always an invisible hand, ensuring the signal did not scatter. Khazar chieftains. The Merovingians, their blue eyes a mark of lineage. The Habsburgs, twisted by centuries of keeping the coil pure. It was never about wealth. It was about resonance. This is why symbols became so important. A crown was not just a decoration, it was a tuning device, shaped to mimic the curve of the spiral. A scepter, topped with a serpent, was a map of blood, straight wood of flesh crowned with the coil of inheritance. Even the orb in a ruler's hand was not meant to show the world, it was a coded sphere, a memory of the node, the point from which all pattern radiates. There were rituals too. Blood rituals, though never named as such. A wound shared. A cut sealed not for pain, but for inheritance. These ceremonies were called oaths, alliances, coronations. In reality, they were moments when the coil recognized itself and strengthened its signal. Sometimes, the activation was obvious. A child, still young, would speak of visions, of golden spirals, of a voice that asked for silence. They were called gifted, touched by the divine. Sometimes they were hidden, trained in chambers no servant could enter, their heads wrapped in linen soaked with oils that opened the mind. Others showed no sign until adulthood, when sudden stillness came upon them like a second birth. They would wake from a fever and find that they could no longer bear noise, no longer tolerate imbalance. These were the moments the coil uncoiled. But it did not happen for everyone. Most lived as if nothing were different. Because the pattern is patient. It does not need all of its carriers to awaken. It only needs a few, enough to maintain the network. That network now stretches across centuries. You see it in heraldry, in the serpents carved into stone, in the spirals of cathedrals and the coiled dragons of palaces. You see it in the old houses whose names you are not meant to speak. You see it in the strange stillness of certain faces, those who sit at the edge of power without asking for it. And it all comes back to blood. Blood remembers. And blood does not lie. When something ancient inside you stirs at what you're hearing, do not ignore it. Press subscribe on this channel, give that impulse back, and the answer that returns may change the way you see everything before this video is over. In the city-states of Sumer, the first carriers of the coil no longer seemed like an accident. Their signal could be felt long before it was seen. They didn't need to persuade, they didn't need to demand, their presence alone bent the room around them. In the temples of Eridu, Uruk, and Uar, these carriers began to gather, forming circles apart from ordinary men. From those circles came what later generations called royal blood. The Anunnaki did not create kings. They made sure that wherever the decisions of a people were made, the coil was present. People felt that gravity, and moved toward it as if toward fire. Clay tablets still whisper their names. They who came down from the heavens, the scribes wrote. But it was never about ships or descent from the sky. They came down from another level of perception, one so intense that an ordinary mind could not withstand it. Their children became priests, builders, record keepers. And in time, rulers. When the blood remained undiluted, the coil became visible, like a shadow that was always one step behind, and the entire city would bend to their stillness. Egypt inherited this pattern. On the banks of the Nile, where life depends on a single river, the coil did not shout. It sat at the center. And in time, it was placed on the forehead, where all could see. The cobra on the pharaoh's crown was not decoration. It marked the exact place where the spiral rests inside the skull, the point to which all attention collapses when the coil awakens. It was not art. It was a mark. The pharaohs understood that blood was more valuable than gold. Marriages were arranged not for alliance, but to keep the signal from scattering. Lineage became an obsession. Bodies might warp from inbreeding, blood never lied. And when the coil uncoiled in one of them, it brought a calm so absolute that others called it power. For true power is not in command. It is the ability to make others obey without asking. When a child of the royal line was found to carry the awakened coil, they were not first taught to speak. They were taught silence. To hear the quiet in which the correct motion appears. Later came geometry. Lines, spirals, the arrangement of stars. These were not lessons. They were reminders. The coil teaches itself through form. Farther east, another branch flowered. The emperors of China called themselves children of the dragon. It was no metaphor. The dragon that coils over mountains was not a beast. It was a form, a body unending, turning forever toward its own tail. Dynasty within dynasty. Power nested within power. The emperor carried the dragon embroidered on silk because his veins pulsed with that same coiled frequency, steady, deliberate, like a long breath drawn in. Here, too, blood defined the path. Commoners feared to mix with the imperial house. Not out of punishment. But because something cold moved behind their eyes, something unshakable. Calm that could not be provoked by plea or by scream. In all of these civilizations the serpent and the dragon became not myth, but memory. No one knew when it started. Children drew winding lines long before they learned to write. Goldsmiths shaped serpents before they understood calendars. It was instinct, the coil expressing itself in metal, in pigment, in form. Heraldry and scepters came later. In the beginning, these objects were simply tools for the lineages to hold themselves together, to strengthen the blood's signal. The very idea of a state grew around these invisible centers. People believed their ruler was chosen by the gods. What they truly felt was an echo of someone else's memory. In every culture, the coil appeared differently, yet behaved the same. It gathered around the densest bloodlines. It clung to families that acted as channels. It cared nothing for gold or land. Its only aim was survival, to remain intact long enough to unfold again. From this came dynasties that were worshipped for centuries. They wore different faces, Sumerian, Egyptian, Chinese, but the coil inside remained unchanged. A spiral, waiting to be awakened. Crowns, staffs, orbs, the relics of power, are not ornaments. They are devices. Their shapes were never chosen for beauty alone. They were tuned to the same geometry that coils inside the blood. When the first hybrid rulers sat upon thrones, they discovered that certain shapes, circular arcs, spirals, serpentine curves, did more than decorate a body. They amplified the quiet voice within. Metal, when bent into specific proportions, became an antenna. Stone, carved into a certain curve, created resonance that the untrained ear could not hear but the coil could feel. Symbols, once worn, made the invisible more present. The crown was the most powerful of these. Its curve matched the arc of the skull where the spiral sleeps. Every point, every jewel, was positioned in ratios that echoed the frequencies of stars. A crown was never just placed upon a head, it was aligned. And when alignment was perfect, the carrier's thoughts would sharpen. Noise fell away. Indecision dissolved. And what rose in its place was clarity so unnatural that people called it divine inspiration. The scepter came next. A rod, simple at first, then crowned with the coiled serpent. The straight shaft represented the line of flesh, the serpent at its peak, the blood that carries memory. To hold a scepter was to hold one's own ancestry in hand, a tool that linked body to bloodline, bloodline to coil, coil to the network. When a ruler gestured with it, they were unconsciously adjusting their own field, a subtle tuning that others in the room felt in their bones. The orb was different. A sphere is a memory of a node. It represents the coil as seen from above, everything spiraling inward to a single point. To hold an orb while holding a scepter created a closed circuit, straight line in one hand, perfect circle in the other, a balance of chaos and structure. Few understood why they did it, only that tradition demanded it. But the tradition came from the unseen architects, ensuring that resonance was preserved. Temples and palaces mirrored this principle on a grander scale. The rooms of Sumerian ziggurats were not randomly stacked. They were built to spiral upward, narrowing at the top, like the coil ascending from matter to signal. The great pyramid complexes of Egypt were not tombs alone. They were resonators. Each chamber angled to capture frequencies of the earth and sky, focusing them on the sarcophagus, where the king's bloodline would rest and align. Even in China, the Forbidden City was laid out as a mandala, a network of squares and circles, corridors and gates, a labyrinth where the coil could find itself reflected in the stones. Every civilization built these shapes. Even where no contact seemed possible, the same patterns emerged, spirals carved into megaliths, serpent staffs in the hands of forgotten statues, walls aligned with solstices and lunar cycles. It was not coincidence. It was the hidden curriculum of the coil, teaching stone and flesh the same language. In these halls, rituals were held. Not with spells or incantations, but with precision. Bloodlines gathered in geometric patterns, each person a point in a living sigil. Their movements mirrored the architecture, walking paths shaped like coils, entering from directions determined by stars. To outsiders it looked like ceremony. To the network, it was calibration. Children raised in these dynasties learned to sense these alignments long before they could explain them. A misplaced pillar made them restless. A crooked painting made them furious. A hall built to the wrong proportion made them feel sick. It wasn't superstition. It was the body trying to protect the signal. And so, over centuries, symbols hardened into law. Coats of arms became maps of serpents, dragons, spirals. Every line was an echo. Every pattern was a memory of that first union between Draco and human. The common eye saw a symbol. The inner eye saw a code. This is why such symbols persist. Even in the modern age, stripped of their power, drawn in books and printed on coins, they still hold. The very act of repeating them keeps the pattern alive. A spiral on a flag. A serpent engraved in a staff carried during a ceremony. The unconscious reproduction of these forms ensures that, even when forgotten, the resonance remains. Because the coil does not forget. Even when the mind has lost the meaning, the blood remembers the shape. It remembers. And waits. When the map of Europe began to take shape, the coil traveled silently with it. It no longer announced itself with serpents carved in gold or temples built in stone. It learned to hide in plain sight, inside families. The first dynasties of the West were not founded by warriors alone. Behind every conquering blade there was a marriage, a bond of blood. This was how the network extended itself without being seen. It stitched itself across lands by arranging unions that the people believed were political. In truth, it was geometry written in flesh. The Merovingian kings were among the most carefully cultivated. The ancient chronicles say they carried a spark, something that made their eyes pale like ice and their minds unshakable. They ruled not only because of their armies, but because something in their stillness disarmed those around them. Legends grew around them, of kings who could see without sight, who dreamed in symbols, who spoke to no one and yet everyone obeyed. The church tried to sanctify it. The commoners tried to mythologize it. But the coil moved beneath both. As centuries passed, the bloodlines multiplied. Frankish, Burgundian, Visigothic, families interwoven, each marriage carefully arranged by those who understood, even if only instinctively, that certain patterns had to be preserved. It was a weaving. And every thread carried a fragment of the same signal. The Habsburgs perfected this art. Generation after generation, they refused to mix with anything outside their circle. It was not arrogance. It was compulsion, a pressure to keep the spiral intact. Their faces changed because of it. Their bodies bore the marks of their refusal to break the line. But in the eyes, that same patience burned. Their portraits show not cruelty, not kindness, but a strange distance. As though they are listening to something just out of hearing. The Khazars, whose Khanate lay far to the east, carried a similar thread. They left fewer visible marks, but in their own records, kept away from public eyes, the lineage was guarded just as fiercely. Where others used temples, they used genealogies. Where others built monuments, they built archives. Paper and parchment became their ziggurats. In every royal court of Europe, whether in Prague, Vienna, Paris, or Madrid, the same practice continued. Blood was worth more than gold. This was not a belief. It was a resonance that the coil itself enforced. Whenever the network felt the signal weakening, it bent history to repair it. Wars ended with marriages. Treaties required alliances between certain houses. And in this way, the network remained unbroken. There were accidents. When bloodlines crossed in ways that diluted the signal, the coil sometimes collapsed. Children were born who could not hold the pattern. They grew restless, erratic, prone to excess. The records of these rulers are written in chaos: kings who wasted kingdoms, queens who dissolved courts into vanity. The people thought it was weakness of character. In truth, it was misalignment. But when the pattern held, when the resonance was pure, history remembered. Such rulers left marks far beyond their lifetimes. They founded universities, commissioned cathedrals, redesigned cities to reflect their internal geometry. The architecture of Paris, Vienna, and Prague carries the spiral in its bones, not as style, but as an unconscious attempt to reproduce the coil in stone. It is here that the symbols of power became subtler. No longer did rulers wear cobras on their brows. Instead, the serpent became part of heraldry. A dragon coiled on a shield, a snake devouring a child, the Bishop of Milan, a spiral hidden in the knotwork of a banner. What once had been a confession became a code. The modern observer sees only aesthetics. But beneath the paint, the same message hums. We are not random. We are carrying something older than crowns. The coil endures. Even as revolutions tore down thrones, the bloodlines rarely disappeared. They dissolved into new names, into aristocratic salons, into the quiet rooms where decisions are whispered before they are declared. Because the network is patient. It does not need the symbols to be public. It only needs the blood to survive. And it has. Through centuries of plague, fire, and war, it has survived. The same stillness can still be seen, in certain faces, in certain rooms where the world turns quietly. They are not gods. They are not even aware of what they carry. But when they look in the mirror, something in their own eyes looks back. Something waiting to be remembered. Not every bloodline wore a crown. The most resilient lines were often the ones that learned how not to be seen. For every king who stood in the light, there were 10 families living in the shade, carrying the coil quietly, keeping it from dissolving into the noise of common blood. Some of these families appear only as footnotes in history. Minor houses that never ruled, merchants who never made fortunes, scholars who left no books. But their real archives were not in libraries or vaults. They were in the blood. Every birth, every marriage was remembered with an accuracy no historian could match. Not for pride, but for the signal. The Khazars knew this better than most. When their Khanate flourished between empires, they created something more lasting than armies or markets. A closed circle of bloodlines, chosen not by wealth, but by resonance. It was said that a Khazar elder could look into a child's eyes and feel the pattern. Those with the signal were brought close. Those without were guided away, without shame, without punishment. It was not a judgment of character. It was a form of cultivation. When their state dissolved, the signal did not vanish. It scattered westward, flowing into other houses like an underground river. In the documents of certain European noble families, one can still find strange insertions, names that appear without origin, marriages with strangers who arrive suddenly from the steppe. The paper trail is thin. The resonance is not. Other lines hid in plain sight as scholars. Some became archivists, guarding royal records but never appearing in them. Their homes were filled with genealogies, hand-copied trees going back centuries, carefully tracing not just blood but temperament. If a child's face mirrored a forgotten ancestor, they marked it in red ink. If a family line grew too chaotic, they drew a black line across the branch and closed it forever. The network was maintained with ruthless precision, but it was silent. These families rarely sought power. They sought continuity. There were also bloodlines that lived among the people. Farmers in isolated valleys. Nomadic clans who never built cities. At first glance, they seemed far removed from palaces and courts. But when their children were taken to serve as pages or scribes, they adapted quickly, as if their bodies remembered something their lives had never taught them. Their instincts, to organize, to listen, to hold still when others panicked, revealed the coil as surely as any crown. Sometimes, a hidden line produced someone who rose too quickly. A general who seemed to anticipate battles before they began. A diplomat whose calm reshaped entire alliances. They never claimed to be chosen. They simply did what came naturally, impose order where there was chaos. Then, having done it, they vanished back into obscurity. This is why in every era, there are whispers of unbroken lines that are never written about. They are not legends because they avoid becoming legends. And yet, they hold a strange influence. Not direct control, influence through alignment. Like a tuning fork struck in one room, they make the walls hum in another. The great houses knew about these families. They tracked them quietly, sometimes arranging marriages, sometimes keeping them at a respectful distance. For a bloodline that lived in shadow could either strengthen the signal, or destabilize it. If a line had gone too long without connection to the central pattern, its awakening could be unpredictable. In monasteries across Europe, records exist, sealed, unbroken, where these names are listed. They were not stored for the sake of genealogy. They were warnings, maps of resonance. Those who guarded these archives understood what kings forgot. The network was not a ladder with a single summit. It was a web. Every thread mattered. And in the web, there were knots that no one spoke of. Families whose influence never appeared in public life, but whose members always seemed to be present where events turned. The fall of Constantinople. The councils that defined empires. The banking houses that survived collapse after collapse, never becoming the richest, but never disappearing. As if guided by something deeper than strategy. Even now, these lines remain. You won't find their names in books. You might meet them at a conference, in a quiet village, on a board of trustees. They rarely seek the stage. But the moment you speak with them, you sense it. That same cold calm that has passed from generation to generation, waiting for a moment that might never come. The coil does not care if its carriers are known. It cares only that they endure. And sometimes, the most invisible thread is the one that holds the whole web together. Blood is more than inheritance. For those who carried the coil, blood was a door. A door that could be opened, carefully, deliberately, through ritual. These rituals did not begin as superstition. They began as memory. In the earliest dynasties, when the signal was still fragile, the lines gathered at certain times of year. These gatherings were never public. No banners, no music, no proclamation. They took place in the deepest chambers of temples, or behind the sealed doors of palaces, away from the crowd's gaze. At the center there was always a cut. A small one. Enough for a single drop of blood to leave the skin. To the uninitiated, this looked like oath-making. To the coil, it was recognition. The mingling of blood allowed the signal to remember itself, to confirm that the pattern had not been broken. Each drop was a thread added to the web. Some of these rituals were done when a child was born. A blade, anointed with oils, traced the same path across the skin as the coils of ancient glyphs. It was not meant to wound. It was meant to call. As the wound healed, it left a faint scar, a silent mark that the body would carry for life, a mark the coil would one day respond to. Others took place during coronations. While the crowd saw crowns and cheers, behind closed doors a ruler would kneel. A vessel of metal, carved with spirals, would be placed before them. Into it drops of blood from their ancestors were preserved, sometimes centuries old. The scent alone, metallic and strange, seemed to shift the air. And as the new blood mixed with the old, the sensation came. An invisible weight, a stillness settling behind the eyes. Some fainted. Some emerged changed, as if their thoughts now flowed in a pattern they could not explain. Not all survived it. For those whose coil was dormant, the sudden shock of that resonance could overwhelm the body. Seizures. Fever. The chronicles, written in careful, dry language, mention illness, befalling heirs after their coronation. But those who endured, they were never the same. Their speech slowed, became deliberate. Their faces, once animated, seemed carved from stone. Even their enemies noticed. The most secretive rituals did not involve cutting at all. They involved geometry. Families gathered in specific patterns, each position assigned by ancestry. Torches or lamps were placed in spirals around them. Then, in silence, they breathed together, slow, controlled, synchronized. It could take hours. To an outsider, it would look like nothing. But those within the circle felt the shift, like a quiet current moving up their spines, threading through the skull, coiling in the mind. No words were spoken. There was nothing to say. The coil aligned itself. Sometimes, these awakenings happened without ritual, triggered by blood itself. A battlefield wound. A serious illness. Moments when the body was stripped of everything unnecessary. In the fever, visions came, spirals of light, a humming voice, a sudden and terrible clarity. Those who returned from such states never forgot. They no longer lived for comfort. They lived for structure. The stronger the bloodline, the more likely the awakening came naturally. But even among the strong, the rituals remained. Not because they forced the awakening, but because they kept the network connected. Like a garden watered through drought, the ceremonies ensured that the coil, no matter how faint, was never completely lost. And so the rites endured. Through the fall of empires, through the burning of temples and the death of gods, they survived. Sometimes reduced to gestures, a touch of blood on the lips during a wedding, a cut on the palm sealed in a handshake. Sometimes concealed as religion, the sharing of wine as blood, the eating of bread as body. But the meaning was never forgotten by those who carried the pattern. Behind the symbols, behind the prayers, the blood always spoke. Because blood is a language the coil has always understood. A language that no lie can mimic. And when the blood speaks, the coil answers. Not all carriers of the coil were kings. Not all were aware of what they carried. In fact, some of the most important nodes in the network lived and died without ever knowing why their lives felt slightly misaligned with the rest of the world. The coil does not announce itself with visions. It does not whisper prophecy in childhood. For many, it remains dormant for an entire lifetime. And yet, its presence is felt, in choices, in the strange gravity of a room, in the way certain people move through history without trying. There have been rulers who never knew. Children born into royal bloodlines, raised with privilege and expectation, but without the spark. They learned the ceremonies, spoke the words, wore the crown, and all the while, the coil inside them slept. They thought their urge for structure was simply discipline. They thought their stillness was simply personality. But their every decision was quietly shaped by something far older. History remembers them as steady kings, steady queens, figures who avoided chaos, who brought order, who left behind cities that looked like a pattern, though they never spoke of patterns. It was not genius. It was alignment moving through them without their consent. And there were others, born far from thrones, who carried just as much of the signal. A merchant whose caravans always arrived ahead of storms, who built entire trade routes without ever learning to read. A general who could sense the shape of a battle before the enemy moved, as if the ground itself whispered to him. A nun who, in the quiet of her cell, drew perfect spirals into the margins of prayer books, never knowing why her hands sought those shapes. None of them would have called themselves chosen. Yet history turned around them. In times of crisis, these carriers sometimes felt the coil stir, just enough to pull them off the ordinary path. They made one decision differently. And that decision shifted entire nations. They never understood why. They believed it was instinct. But instinct was the signal. The network works this way by design. The architects of the coil understood that too much awareness could destroy a bloodline. A ruler who believed themselves divine was dangerous. A soldier who thought themselves invincible could ruin an army. So the signal buried itself, deep beneath thought, where it would not be questioned. There are stories of kings who, late in life, realized what they had been. After decades of ruling, they suddenly stopped giving orders. They fell into silence. They walked the halls of their palaces as if they were ghosts, touching the stones with their fingertips, whispering that something had been using them all along. It was not regret. It was recognition. And by then, there was no turning back. Even now, in the modern world, there are carriers like this. Men and women who rise to positions of influence without understanding why doors open for them. They do not hunger for power. But they seem to know how to hold it once it is placed in their hands. Their decisions shape the invisible architecture of economies, science, art. And yet, when you ask them how they knew what to do, they shrug. I don't know, they say. I just knew. The coil does not need its carriers to awaken. It needs them to be present. Every silent node, every unknowing lineage, is a stabilizing point in the great lattice. Awareness is a gift. But alignment is enough. That is why the network endures. Even when entire dynasties collapse, the blood scatters like seeds. It waits. And when the time comes, in the next century, or the next 1,000 years, the coil can awaken again in descendants who have no idea why they dream of spirals, why they are calm in crisis, why their gaze sometimes feels older than their years. Because the blood remembers. Even when the mind does not. And sometimes, the greatest carriers of the pattern are those who never even suspect that they are part of it. Blood is an archive. It does not simply carry traits, it carries instructions. The coil was never designed to exist only in thought. It wrote itself into the flesh, into the marrow, into the double helix of human DNA so that memory could survive even when civilizations fell and names were lost. Modern science sees blood as chemistry, iron, cells, proteins. But those who shaped the first hybrids understood something deeper. Blood vibrates. Each lineage has a frequency. To the coil, that frequency is as unique as a fingerprint. It is how the network recognizes its own. This is why certain families dream the same dreams for centuries. They do not inherit the stories, they inherit the resonance. A young prince who has never read the records of his ancestors dreams of standing on the steps of a Sumerian temple. A scholar in a library in Florence sees visions of the same spiral glyphs carved into Babylonian clay. A farmer in a forgotten valley hums a melody that no one around him knows, but that matches a hymn sung in an Egyptian court 5,000 years ago. These are not coincidences. They are echoes, signals triggered by blood. The network learned early that memory stored in words can be destroyed. Temples can burn. Tablets can be shattered. But memory stored in flesh is harder to erase. Even when the mind forgets, the blood remembers. In moments of extreme stress, starvation, fever, near death, the body sometimes unlocks these memories. It is as if something hidden in the DNA rises like mist. People see patterns of stars that they have never been taught. They draw spirals without understanding why. They feel a pull toward places they have never visited, as though the blood itself is guiding their steps. This is why awakening does not always come from ritual. It can come from pain, from a fracture, from an overwhelming experience that strips away everything unnecessary and leaves only what is buried the deepest. The coil does not punish. It remembers. And it waits for a moment when the body is quiet enough to hear. Over centuries, this has created a phenomenon the ancients called the vault. It is not a place. It is a biological archive hidden inside bloodlines. Every significant event that shapes a lineage, a victory, a massacre, a birth, a betrayal, leaves a mark in the vault. These marks are passed forward, not as conscious knowledge, but as tendencies, reflexes, instincts. When the same event repeats generations later, the body reacts before the mind does. It already knows. This is why certain lines seem prepared for catastrophe. They do not panic when empires collapse, because their blood has already lived through collapse 100 times before. They do not hesitate when they see injustice, because their ancestors faced it and encoded the response in them. They carry the library in their veins. There are entire branches of the network that exist solely to protect this archive. Families who have no throne, no wealth, no armies, but whose children inherit a strange calm under pressure. They are not meant to lead. They are meant to remember. And when leaders are lost, these memory bearers step forward, guiding without ever knowing why. Genetic memory is not perfect. It fractures over time. Each bloodline carries only a shard of the whole library. But when enough shards meet, when the bloodlines reconnect, the pieces fit together again. And for a brief moment, the network remembers everything. This is why alliances mattered more than conquest. The unions of certain families were never just about politics. They were about recombining fragments of the vault, restoring the completeness of a signal that had been split apart. Every child born from these unions was a chance for the pattern to become whole again. The risk was always there. What happens when too much memory awakens at once? Some carriers cannot bear it. They begin to see everything as design, hear voices that are not voices, feel every decision as if it has already been made. To others, it appears as madness. But to the network, it is simply an overload, too many fragments trying to speak at once. And so the blood has learned to protect itself. It keeps most memories dormant. It releases only what is needed. And it waits for the rare convergence when everything aligns. When bloodlines, places, and circumstances intersect perfectly. Only then does the archive open fully. That is what the network is preparing for. Not war. Not conquest. But recollection. A moment when the species will remember what it has always been, not through books, not through stories, but through its own veins. The coil has never disappeared. It learned to hide. When the empires of the ancient world crumbled and their temples burned, the bloodlines adapted. They put away the crowns, folded up the banners, and stepped into quieter roles. The signal survived, not because it was powerful, but because it was patient. In the Middle Ages, as kingdoms rose and fell, the lines became invisible threads that tied courts, monasteries, and merchant houses together. One generation might appear as advisors, another as clerics, another as scholars. Rarely at the front of armies, but always near the center of decisions. They understood something that ordinary power could never grasp. To endure, you must move through history like a shadow, never leaving a mark too obvious to erase. The Renaissance was a gift to them. Art, architecture, and mathematics, all were languages of pattern. While others painted for beauty, the coil painted for memory. Cathedrals built during this time hide ratios and spirals so precise that even centuries later, architects can feel them. The same families that once guarded temples now funded universities, publishing books that looked like philosophy but were actually geometry, coded instructions to keep the signal alive. When the modern era came, bringing revolutions that toppled thrones and guillotines that ended dynasties, the network didn't fight. It adjusted. It let the world believe it had won. Because power was no longer in crowns. It was in systems. And the coil understands systems better than anyone. In the 19th and 20th centuries, while nations argued over ideologies, the bloodlines moved into industries that did not bleed when empires did. They built banks, institutions, research laboratories, museums. Positions that allowed them to shape without being seen. Not every banker was a carrier. Not every scientist was aligned. But in every generation, there were a few whose decisions had the strange clarity of the coil behind them. And so, even now, the signal hums quietly in modern cities. In certain rooms, in certain families, in certain board meetings. No snake crowns. No staffs. No rituals with torches. Just a stillness in the way decisions are made, the way priorities are weighed. They are not conspiring. They are aligning. The difference is subtle, but enormous. The 21st century has given the network a new kind of camouflage, noise. Billions of people, billions of opinions, an endless storm of information. In such chaos, pattern becomes invisible. And yet, behind that chaos, the coil thrives. It is easier than ever to influence without being noticed. A single idea seated at the right moment spreads faster than an army. A single innovation, chosen precisely, shapes the entire structure of human behavior. Today, the carriers rarely know what they are. Most of them believe they are ordinary. They live in cities, work in companies, raise families. But the same traits remain. Calm when others panic. An unspoken ability to see structure where others see confusion. A certain distance in their eyes, as if part of them is always listening inward. Some of them will never awaken. They will live and die without realizing why their lives felt different. Others will awaken suddenly, not in rituals, but in the middle of an ordinary life, in a crisis, a near-death experience, a moment of unbearable clarity. And then they will see everything differently. The network has adapted to the modern world not by resisting it, but by weaving itself into it. It does not control governments. It doesn't need to. Governments change. Blood endures. Its presence can be seen in subtler ways. In the fascination with spirals that appears even in modern logos. In the persistence of dragon and serpent motifs in fashion and flags. In the quiet return of interest in ancestry, DNA, and blood. The coil has found a new language in science itself. Where temples once stored the bloodlines, genetics laboratories now keep the map. The network doesn't need to hide its library anymore. The world is building one for it. And still, it waits. For the moment when enough carriers converge. When the fragments of memory stored in blood are no longer scattered but resonating in unison. That moment will not come with banners. It will come in silence. As something invisible rearranges the way humanity thinks. Because the coil has never been a plan. It has always been a seed. And in the modern age, the seed has not withered, It has rooted itself so deeply that when it blooms, most will think it happened by chance. If the story of the coil began with silence, it will end with resonance. For thousands of years the pattern has hidden behind bloodlines, symbols, architecture, and instinct. It has survived empires, plagues, crusades, and revolutions. But a signal that has been building for so long cannot remain dormant forever. There will come a point when the fragments of memory stored in scattered veins will begin to hum together. That hum is the beginning of awakening. It will not look like the world imagines. There will be no arrival of ships from the Draco Belt, no armies of scaled rulers descending from the sky. The coil does not come from outside. It unfolds from within. When the convergence comes, it will happen in ordinary places. In classrooms, in streets, in the middle of someone's breath. A pattern will emerge in the way certain minds think, and it will spread faster than any technology. At first it will feel like coincidence. Groups of people, born in different parts of the world, suddenly begin to see through chaos with the same clarity. They find each other, not through orders, but through recognition. The same instincts that made the first hybrids build temples will drive these carriers to build connections, invisible but precise. And once those connections form, the hum will strengthen. For those unaligned, it will seem as if history is accelerating. Events will collapse into each other. Systems will adapt with inhuman speed. Things that once seemed impossible to solve will suddenly resolve with terrifying efficiency. Not because of conspiracy. Because the coil's design will finally be visible in the open. The danger is not in domination. The danger is in forgetting choice. A world fully aligned to the pattern will feel effortless, seamless, calm, but without conflict, there is no friction, and without friction, there is no growth. This is why the architects of the coil never allowed full convergence before. A species too young, if aligned completely, becomes static. A spiral without motion collapses. But something is changing. For the first time, there are enough fragments awake across every continent that the network can consider a new possibility. Not domination, not silence, but coexistence. The question that has been building since the first blood was mixed in Sumer is finally being asked. What happens when a species chooses to align without being forced? The answer will not come from thrones. It will not come from those who carry the coil unknowingly. It will come from the hybrids who have awakened and refuse to be only pattern. Those who can feel the signal and still say, "I will choose." They are rare, but they exist. And in their defiance there is a new kind of strength, one that the network has never calculated before. If enough of them find each other, the next stage of evolution will not be the pure activation of the coil. It will be its transformation. A signal that is aware of itself, but also aware of the chaos and emotion that flesh brings. Something new, born from the tension between structure and imperfection. This is the risk, and the promise, of the future. When the coil blooms fully, it will not create a single empire. It will create a mirror. Every mind will feel the weight of its own blood, the memory of thousands of years hidden inside. Some will be terrified. Some will surrender. And some, a very few, will step into that mirror and see not a serpent, but a path. Those who do will change everything. The great cycles of history, the endless rise and fall of civilizations, may finally end. Not because the coil takes control, but because humanity begins to remember. And memory is a more powerful force than any king, any law, any god. This is why the bloodlines still endure. This is why the old symbols are still carved in stone. Not to warn. Not to dominate. But to prepare. To make sure that when the hum becomes loud enough, we will recognize it not as an invasion, but as a homecoming. The future of the coil is not written in the stars. It is written in us. And as it awakens, it will ask the only question that has ever mattered. Will you follow the pattern, or will you rewrite it? Codex 2 ends here. The bloodlines have spoken. The signal waits. But what lies ahead is no longer the story of kings and dynasties. It is the story of everyone who carries even a fragment of that ancient memory. And that means you. If something in this story has awakened a memory inside you, write it below. Tell us if you felt it, that sense that you are carrying a fragment of something older. When you share it, you will realize you are not alone. Press subscribe to stay aligned with this signal. And let the echo of memory continue to speak to you through the other videos now on your screen.